Good evening. Welcome to How WordPress Works. Tonight we are going to specifically be talking about how the boot process works. We're going to look at from the initial request until the response from the server. We're going to see what WordPress does in the middle to make all the magic happen. As Steve said, my name is Dominic. I have been working with WordPress for about 3 years now. Most of my experience comes from personal projects, but I have done a little bit of professional work as well. I am also going to school, which takes up the vast majority of my time right now. I'm working toward a computer science degree from CUNY here in the city. You can find out more about who I am at humanshell.net, which is where my most recent post is, which led to this presentation. I'm also on Twitter at human_shell, and you can see my open source contributions at github.com/humanshell. What are we going to be learning tonight? Specifically, I hope when we all leave, you'll know a little bit more about where the configuration comes from in WordPress, how the core uses that configuration information to load everything it needs to produce a proper environment for returning a WordPress page, how WordPress allows us to interact with this process. We do that with constants and with action hooks. We'll see that as we move through it. And hopefully we'll also know how, at the end of the process, the proper template is picked and returned back to your visitor. Like Steve said, there is going to be a lot of information, so at certain points we're probably going to be glossing over a few things. If you haven't read my post, please check it out. There's much more detail there. The website theme.fm also just recently completed a 3-part series about the exact same information. They did a really good job, so you might be able to get some information from there that you may not find in my post. Basically, every website based on PHP starts with index.php, and WordPress is no different. It has an index.php file in its root directory that has 2 jobs. It starts by defining a constant named WP useThemes. It sets that to true by default. It then requires a file named WP blog header. This file is responsible for continuing the whole initialization process for WordPress. WP useThemes, since it is default set to true, I was curious about why you would ever use false, and I found 2 scenarios. One is if you are only using WordPress just for the content management. You only want to go to WP admin, you just want to see the back end, you have no publicly facing end to your site. If that's the case, you can redefine WP useThemes to false in your WP config file, which we're going to see a little bit later. The second scenario is more common. If you have, or if a client of yours has an existing site that isn't built on WordPress, you can do what's called integrating WordPress. And you accomplish that by taking the WordPress directory, name it something simple like blog, you put that into the root directory of the existing site. Then you create a PHP file in which you basically replicate index.php. We can see index.php. We can see index.php, and like I just said, WP useThemes is true, and WP blog header gets required. In your custom PHP page in this existing non-WordPress site, you create, we'll just call it blog.php, and you add this information to that, except you define WP useThemes to false, because you're not going to need a template. You have an existing site with an HTML structure, with CSS, with JavaScript, you have everything you need. What you don't have is the WordPress environment, and that's what this does. When you define that in blog.php, you will tell WordPress not to use a template, and you will kick off what we're about to see, which is the whole boot process coming from WP blog header. It all starts at WP blog header. And then in that custom PHP file, after these lines, you now have access to, anybody who goes to that page, you have access to all of WordPress's features. So you have a WordPress blog integrated into an existing site. The loop is there, widgets are there, everything is available to you, so you've got a little custom blog page ready to go. We will take a look at, and that's the code that we just looked at. WP blog header, like I said, is responsible for starting the whole process of booting. It does that by first requiring a file named WP load. That file has two responsibilities: setting the abs path constant and loading the WP config file. We're going to see that in a second. After the process started by requiring WP load, because it gets pretty complex at this point, WP blog header will execute a function named WP. We're going to see that later. And then it finishes by requiring template loader.php. And we can see that in WP blog header right here. It requires WP load, it calls the WP function, and it requires WP load. I'm sorry, template load. Before we move on to see what WP load does, I want to make sure we all understand how execution progresses in a PHP environment. WP load is required here, so its contents are brought in at that point. At the end of WP load, it's going to require another file, which brings its contents in at that point. And then that file is going to require yet another file where we will see the whole core of WordPress being loaded. So all I want you to understand is that we're starting WP load, we're going to talk about a whole mess of stuff. And then once all of that is complete, we're going to come back to WP blog header and see how it completes the loading of the entire thing. WP load. It's got two jobs, because the last two go hand in hand. It starts by defining your abs path variable, which will always point to the root directory of your WordPress site. It then locates and loads by using PHP's require function. It loads in your WP config file. If it cannot find your WP config file, it falls back on code that will redirect you to a page. Some of you may have already seen it. A page that says you have no config file, please create one. And we can see that being done here. We can see abs path being defined right here. Some error reporting being turned on, that's a PHP function. Before I talk about WP config, I just want to point out something about abs path. I hope everybody can read that. How's that? It's not getting bigger. It's getting bigger on my screen. Is it getting bigger up there?
Yes.
All right, good. So we've got our abs path here. And I just want to point out that WordPress here, it makes no assumptions about where your root directory is or what it's named. It figures it out dynamically at execution time, which is very powerful. It allows us to name our root directory whatever we want to name it and put it wherever you can point your server to serve the files from. It does that by using, that's a PHP environment variable, that's the file environment variable, which will always contain the name of the current file that we're executing. It passes that to dir name, which will always return the directory that that file is in. So it builds that dynamically each time you go through it. And then it starts looking for your WP config, which starts right here. The WordPress core will look for your WP config in two spots. It'll first check to see if it's in the current directory, which is where it is by default. If it's there, it requires it and we move on. If it's not there, it checks to see if it's up one directory level. You can move your WP config up one directory level for security and other advanced functionality. I'll talk a little bit about that stuff. But it's also important to note that in that second check, it is looking to see if it's up one directory, but that directory does not contain a WP settings file. Because what that would mean is that your WordPress directory is inside of another WordPress directory, which would make no sense. So there's no point in including the file. At which point, if neither of those two things are true, then you are going to get sent to, you see this text right here. That text all gets output onto a page with a nice little link for you to go and create your own WP config file. Uses for keeping WP config up one level, there's a couple of them. If you're already familiar with this functionality, you've probably been told that it is about security, which it is. It's always good to take advantage of doing things differently than the other 20 million sites out there. Everything you can do to make it harder for somebody to locate your WP config, to locate your WordPress directory, anything you can do to make that harder is a good move in the step of moving towards security. Other reasons are, it's actually pointed out in the comments, I like this, in the third paragraph here, it says it will search in the parent directory to allow WordPress directory to remain untouched, which is nice. If you think about, let's say you're developing a plugin or a theme, and obviously you want to test that against as many different versions of WordPress as you can find. So you might want to have your WordPress directory as an SVN checkout. You bring the WordPress directory down, and now you can use the SVN switch statement, switch from trunk to 3.2.1 to beta, go back to 2.5, see how your plugin and your theme works on that. It allows you to keep that directory clean, and your WP config can stay safe in the parent directory. Because we're also going to see how the WP config file can be used to store a lot of local customizations that allow you to control the way your site is going to boot. One last benefit is if you're doing any automated deployments, you're using maybe Capistrano to deploy your WordPress site from your local development environment, which is always a good idea to be doing your development locally, and you're automating the push up to your live production environment using something like Capistrano. Keeping your WP config outside of that is a good idea because you can add. Mark Jakewith actually did a great presentation on this. I think it was at this year's WordCamp San Francisco, where he explains how he uses WP config to determine if he is working locally or if he is on a production environment, and connecting that up with the whole automated deploy process. Theme.fm that I mentioned earlier also just finished another 3-part series where they go way in depth on how to do that, how to set up Capistrano, how to do it. I highly recommend checking that out. Even if you're not planning on doing it, it's great stuff to know. So at this point, we have our apps path defined. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to assume that your WP config is good to go. And we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the WP config. I think out of all the core files that I've looked at in this process, WP config is probably the one that's most familiar to us. It wasn't too long ago that we still had to manually edit this file. In the 5-minute install now, it gets generated for you. It asks for your database credentials, it asks for you to create an initial user, and it generates your salts and everything that you need for a properly working WP config. When I started with WordPress, you got the 5-minute install. It was only advertised as a 5-minute install because it was 5 minutes up until the point that you had to figure out how to configure your WP config file. You had to go to WordPress.org to a special URL that generated unique salts. You had to copy and paste them. It was crazy. Its main responsibilities are defining your MySQL settings so that WordPress can talk to your database. Like I just said, it generates those unique salts and keys which are used for cookies and authentication. It defines a database table prefix. It allows you to set what language your blog is to be displayed in. It allows you to enable debugging mode, and then it finishes its job by requiring wp-settings.php. That is the bad boy. wp-settings.php has everything. Before we move into it, I just want to touch on WP config again quickly. I mentioned that it offers you the ability to do a lot of local customizations to control what we're about to see. We're going to see a lot of constants being set, a lot of functions being run, basically functionality flying all over the place. Every time a constant is set from here on out in WP settings, which is singularly responsible for loading the core of WordPress, what we call WordPress, all functions that we're familiar with, that comes from core WordPress. WP settings.php does that. When it's defining its constants as we move through this file, it checks to see if they're set first, which means you have the opportunity to set those constants in WP config before we get to that point. And we will see that. I compiled just some brief statistics. I estimate, I'm not getting this number from anywhere that you can rely on. I estimate that it's responsible for roughly 90% of the entire boot process. It does almost everything. It requires 56 individual files from the WP Includes directory, which is where the core lives. The WP Includes directory is a huge amount of files inside of which the functions that we use to build themes and plugins are defined. It is directly responsible for executing 28 individual functions. Obviously, there's a lot more than 28 functions that are being executed in the loading of the core. But this file is directly responsible for 28 of them. It also executes 7 action hooks, which we'll see as we walk through this process. They're the locations where WordPress allows you to, in your plugins and your themes, affect how the initialization is progressing. I've broken WP settings into 6 distinct sections because it's a long file, it's a complicated file, a lot of the information is extremely technical. I'm still trying to figure out a lot of it myself. So we have 6 sections that we're going to take a look at. The first one I named initialization. I know we're talking about initialization generally of the entire WordPress core, but in this part of WP settings, it's going to lay the groundwork. Everything that it's going to need, it's going to build upon and build upon and build upon. We can see that in WP settings. Do I need to make that bigger again? It starts with a new constant, WP Inc., which just points to the WP Includes directory. It now uses your abs path and your WP Inc. to load 3 files that are essential to its job of loading up the actual core environment. And we're going to see those functions as we work through it. Actually, we see one now. We see the WP initial constants, which if we take a look at that, this is defined in the default -constants.php file. If we take a look at that, we can see it's defined in default constants, like I said. And what it does is it defines a memory limit. It's multi-site. Max memory limit. It's setting your blog ID. It's setting more memory limit, your content directory. It's setting WP debug to false. You see if it's not already defined, because we could have turned that to true in our WP config file. It is also doing debug display, debug log, debug WP cache, which we're also going to see that being used in a second, which is the constant either true or false, which lets your advanced plugins like W3 Total Cache or Super Cache or Bat Cache, it allows them to load at the proper time. They're responsible for setting that to true. And then it also sets media trash and a constant called short init, which we'll see in a couple of sections. And we can see from my description there, it requires load, default constants, and version, which gives us 30 functions and 6 variables. Those come from version.php. Things like what WordPress version are you using, what PHP version are you using, what SQL version are you using, used throughout the boot process, and not just the boot process. In your own plugins and themes, you can check these versions and enable specific functionality depending upon the version of the WordPress that you're running. And then you can see there it loads advanced caching plugins. So back into WP settings, we just saw WP initial constants. Next up, that function comes from load.php, and it's fairly self-explanatory from its name. It checks to make sure that your PHP and MySQL is above the minimum requirement. After that, these are 2 PHP functions. These don't come from WordPress. It's turning magic quotes off. Magic quotes, if you're familiar with PHP, you know you can have a string enclosed in double quotes, and it will perform what's called variable interpolation, where it takes a variable inside of that string, and at runtime, it will replace it with the actual value of that variable. I think it's being turned off here from the best that I can tell because that's a security risk. We haven't connected to the database yet, so we don't want to introduce any possible SQL injection attacks. That's, from my research, that's the best I can tell from turning off magic quotes. They're going to be turned back on again later after the database is set up. We set the default time zone. It runs a function that unregisters globals in a PHP environment. You can, with registered globals on, you have access to every global variable whenever you want from whatever function you want. So here it's turning that off. So if you want to use global variables in PHP, you have to specifically define them in the function that you want to use them in. It's another security measure to keep out unwanted global variables from flying around the system. It's unsetting these next two just to make sure that there's no stale values somehow left over in these two variables here. The next function is WP fix server vars. We'll take a look at that one. I'm pretty sure this comes from WP load. And it is going to set up a bunch of stuff for us. You got your default server values. It is redefining the $_server PHP environment variable. It's actually doing that across the board. It's normalizing the $_server variable for later use in the init process, in the boot process. After that, we get WP fave icon request, which is a really cool function. So is the next one, WP maintenance. WP fave icon request will, when it's run, it will determine if the browser is just asking for a fave icon, which is the little thing that shows up. If you don't know what that is, it is this little thing that shows up in here, that little image file. Apparently browsers do this all the time, over and over and over again, so much so that it would probably crash your server if they weren't checking for this. It looks to see if it's asking for a fave icon. If it is, it returns the fave icon to the requesting client and then halts the boot process completely, because obviously there's no reason to continue going after that point. WP maintenance is fun. It will look in your root directory and check the timestamp of a file named .maintenance. If that file exists and it was created within the last 10 minutes, it also halts the boot process and redirects you over to a predefined maintenance page. It also, in the definition, let's go ahead and open it. You can define your own maintenance page. So you're sitting at home and your client calls and says, the site's broke, doesn't work. You just SSH in real quick, touch a .maintenance file right in your root, and now for the next 10 minutes, WordPress is going to throw everybody to the maintenance file while you have a chance to figure out what's going on. Just have a look at that. If in the apps path .maintenance exists, or define WP installing, then just return. It includes .maintenance. Checks the time since upgrading, and there, maintenance.php. If file exists, if you define maintenance.php in your WP content directory, it will use that file. So you can have a custom maintenance file when you're in the middle of doing work on your site. We get timer start, which, from the best I can tell, I think it's for the developers. I think they run this when they want to see if the changes they're making have adversely affected other functions. Because I can't find a timer stop anywhere. I can only see the start. WP debug mode does just what it says. It checks to see if you're currently in debug mode, and if you are, then it enables all of PHP's debugging. Debug mode is important, especially when you're working locally, because what you don't want to happen is while you're building your plugin or your theme, and when you break something, you don't want to just get the white screen back. you actually want to see some information about why it failed, where it failed, how it failed, and what were the errors that it reported. WP debug mode enables all of that for you. Here's where the advanced caching plugins come in. If you have them on your site, they will have set WP cache to true. And so if it is true, then you will get, they also provide this file, advanced cache. Those come from the caching plugins. It basically defines how to start up their caching plugin. So if WP cache is true, your caching plugin will start running that. And then you set the function WP set lang directory will literally set your language directory. I'm not familiar with localization and language settings, so that's one of the things that we're going to probably be glossing over. That is section 1, and you can see it really just set up that baseline. It determined what was going on, who was making the request, is caching enabled, is debugging enabled, all of the little pieces of information that are needed in order to complete the rest of the process. After initialization, we get early WordPress files. That's not supposed to be breaking like that. It's the resolution I'm using that's supposed to be on one line. But basically what it does is it loads early core utility and class files. It creates the connection to the database. It defines most of the actions and filters for the hook system. And it begins the multi-site setup if you've enabled that in your WP config. And it checks to make sure WordPress is installed. And we can see all that happening here. Obviously, you're not going to see these comments. I just put these in so that I know where I was when I was going through this file. The early WordPress files, compat.php, it defines compatibility functions. Anything that isn't provided by PHP or not provided by default, WordPress defines in this file so that it can use them. Functions.php, which is a huge file, over 4,500 lines, serves the same purpose that the functions.php file serves in your theme. It's a place for utility and helper methods to be defined and used later. Class-WP defines the WordPress global class object. We'll pop that open real quick. In class WP, we're actually going to see this later when it's time for to finish up with templating. You can see the definition of the class and all of its instance variables and all of its methods, which these methods are used later on. We're going to see them all get initialized and run. After that, class WP error is very similar to class WP. It defines a WordPress error class, so that WordPress can send its errors to that class file and handle them appropriately. Plugin.php, we're here in section 2, and plugin.php is literally the file that defines the entire WordPress plugin API. You have, this is where all, the plugin API is hooks, action and filter hooks. You get everything here. If you're a plugin developer, this is where you want to go. This is what will tell you how all the actions and filter hooks operate. There's add filter, has filter, apply filters, ref array, remove filter, remove all filters, current filter, actions, add and do action, did action. Everything you need to make your plugin work, and also to make the rest of the core loading work, because we're about to see some actions where we can insert some functionality. After that, these next 3 functions will connect WordPress core to your database. It uses everything that was defined in WP config and creates the connection. The first one calls it a database file, a DB file that basically controls how WordPress is going to interface with your database. And I just want to point out, it also allows you to define your own. You can see it requires WPDB, but if you create db.php, it will require that, and that allows you to define your own custom interface to the database. WordPress doesn't have to use its default one. You can write your own. The WP set WP DB bars is responsible for basically making sure that once it's connected, everything is talking and operating properly. All the variables are set. Access to tables is all working properly so that later on when it's time to actually get content, it all works. And the last one is an object cache. Its job is to take often used SQL queries and cache them, speeding up the performance of your site. If they're used all the time, there's no point in running them over and over and over again. And so those three functions right there handle everything involved in connecting to your database. This next file, default filters, goes hand in hand with plugin.php. It is the definition of all of the filters and actions, most, as the comments say, most of the filters and actions that are available to plugin authors and theme developers as well. If you're ever developing a theme or a plugin and you wanted to know where can I attach this functionality to, I can't find a list anywhere, this file will tell you. It has all the filters. It has all the actions. Here's your WP head actions, which I think we've all used in the head of our themes. There's WP footer, login head, login footer, RSS related actions. There's the generator, if you've ever used an action to remove versions from the head of your theme. There's the generator. Sanitize cookie comments, there's feed actions. Almost all of them are here. I don't know what they mean by most, but it looks like almost all of them. The POMO directory and MO files are how you handle language changes and localization on your file. If you want it to be in French, you get a French MO file. If you want it to be in Brazilian, you get which would be Portuguese, I guess, you get a Portuguese MO file. You put them into POMO, and that's the language that will be loaded and used. We see our first check for Multisite, which again, if you've enabled in your WP config, then is Multisite will return true, and it'll start loading the files that we've been looking at. It will start loading them for Multisite. They kind of run in parallel. You load a little bit of WordPress, and then you check for Multisite. You load a little bit of WordPress and check for Multisite. We'll see a couple more of these as we go on. Short init, which came from section 1, that was WP initial constants, I'm pretty sure. Could not find out for the life of me how that works. I had to email Mark Jaquith, the core developer. He told me there are advanced uses of WordPress, like using it as a proxy or a reverse proxy, where you're good with everything up until now. You don't need anything else for what you're going to be using this WordPress install for. So if you set short init to true in your WP config, that return false will end the loading. And obviously whatever you are using WordPress for will take over at that time. Your proxy code will come online and take over from there. I10N or L10N is also language related. And then the WP not installed function. At this point we'll look. Load.php, again, that's back from section 1. Not installed will look for the existence of things that should be there if you have installed WordPress. If you haven't, this link here gets set to the WP admin install path, which is where you go when WordPress hasn't been installed. And if it can't find the files that it needs, it requires a few that it's going to need for installation, and then redirects you to the install path and does. Section 3. So that's the early files. We have the initialization files, early files which are bringing in a lot of functionality, and now we have most of WordPress. This section will require 36 WordPress core files. Those files contain most of what we're familiar with. Have post, the post, query, working with widgets, all of those functions that we use in our themes and our plugins. It defines plugin directory constants, so it's easier to, because in the next step we're actually going to load the plugins for our site, so it defines the constants now. And then it loads must-use plugins and runs the first action hook. If you're not familiar with must-use plugins, they're referred to in this section as MU plugins, so it was throwing me off at first. I thought it was multi-user. It comes from multi-user. You know, it's now Multisite. It merged with WordPress, and so multi-user is now Multisite. The developers of Multisite needed a way to easily enable plugins across the board. You know, WordPress.com uses Multisite. You've got millions of logs. You don't want to log into each and enable the plugins on each of them. So what happens with must-use plugins, you put them into an mu-plugins directory right next to your normal plugins directory. And at this point, after you take a look at these files, you'll see WP get MU plugins. It basically, that function returns an array of any plugin that is in the MU plugin directory. And it will, for each in turn, that for each loop will enable those. There's two caveats though. First of all, an MU plugin will never show up in your admin section. You can't see it, activate it, and delete it. It's on unless you delete it from that folder. And also, they will not do automatic updates. So if you have a must-use plugin and it's being included here, you have to make sure that if a new version comes out, you manually upload it. Otherwise, it's not going to update itself. I do want to open a few of these files. Formatting.php has a fun function. Most of what it does is related to working with text. But at the bottom, this is the second to last function. It has this function, capital P dang it. It is the function that will not allow you to write WordPress improperly capitalized. That's where that comes from. Capabilities is all about the functions that work with users and roles. You've got a WP roles class object, a WP role class object, WP user object, current user can, author can, user can, get role, add role, remove role. Anytime you need to find out if a user is capable of doing something, this is the file that provides those functions. Query is all about what it says. It's all about making queries. These two here, we've got, I left it open because I thought you would recognize these. If have posts, while have posts, the post, the functions necessary for creating the loop in your themes, defined in query.php. There's a bunch of others in here. This is it's a 3,500 line file. It would take forever to go through this, but this is the core functionality being required. All the functions that we rely on to create our WordPress sites are being loaded right now. And it goes on like this. Theme has theme-related functions. You know, is child theme, get style sheet. I think you recognize this one, get style sheet directory URI. You use that in the head of your themes to find the directory to your style sheets. Style sheet URI. Get template. Get template directory URI. They're all being loaded here. You go through each of these and you'd see functions that you recognize. You've got templating functions, meta and user related functions, host related functions. That's not good. Create initial post types. We're actually going to come and see this one in a second because this function gets called. Category-related functions, comment-related functions, working with rewrites, which is another way of saying pretty URLs, permalinks, working with bookmarks, setting jobs to run with cron, all those functions are in there, setting up your taxonomies and querying for taxonomies, which is your links and your tags. Functions for working with updates, short codes, widgets, which here, there's register sidebar, unregister sidebar, Dynamic sidebar is in here. Every function you need to work with your widgets are in this file. And then of course you have navigation menu related functions and the admin bar related functions. So at this point, most of WordPress is now in existence, and we're halfway through. There's another check for Multisite, which does similar. It brings in its own default filters, its own functions file, and its own list of deprecated functions, which if you're ever curious about if you're using a function that's going to be removed, that hasn't been included yet. I thought it got included there, but it doesn't. So it's coming up in a minute.
Oh, 36 over here.
Did I miss it? Oh yeah.
133.
You can always come in here and see, this is where functions go to die. They're never going to come back at you. This is the morgue for functions. So if you're worried your function's going to go away, break your plugin, there's the file you want to have a look at. WP plugin directory constants comes from section 1. That was part of WP default constants. And you can see when this function is run at this point, you get WP content URL, WP plugin directory, WP plugin URL, plugin directory, any constant needed by WordPress to efficiently access the location of your plugins come from executing this function. This is where the MU plugins get loaded that I was talking about. Any must-use plugin that you have in the MU-plugins directory will be loaded by this for each group. And then it unsets it because it doesn't need it anymore. Another check for Multisite, this is where Multisite's plugins come from. Get active and network plugins. If you're running Multisite, your plugins are loaded right now. This is where they come from. And then we see our first do action, which is the MU plugins loaded. So if you have in your theme or in your plugin a need to do something right now during the init process, you can define that function and attach it to this file. Now we've got step 4, which step 4 is all about our plugins. This is the plugins portion. It defines functionality, cookie, and SSL related constants. It's responsible for useful site and visitor specific variables. It creates our initial taxonomies and our initial post types. It registers the theme directory and then loads our plugins. This is a long section. And then it executes 2 more action hooks. And we can see all that happening. You got some MS cookie constants for Multisite. You have WP cookie constants, which there should be default constants again. Yep. You can see, it defines the cookie hash, which is MD5, so your cookies are secure. User cookie, pass cookie, auth cookie, again, all being checked to see if they're already defined. So you can set these yourself in WP config if you want. Auth cookie, secure auth, logged in, test cookie, cookie path, site cookie path, admin cookie path, plugins cookie path, and cookie domain. After that, we get the SSL related constants, which this one's actually quick, also in default constants. This basically is what decides if you are going to be forcing secure sockets layers, SSL logins to your login page and your admin page. As you can see, they're false by default. If you set them to true in your WP config, then true gets passed to force SSL admin and force SSL login, requiring SSL connections. They're false by default because obviously you have to get your certs all in order, or you'd be going to your login, your admin page, you're getting untrusted site names at that point. After that, bars.php is included. This is a fun file. I point out in my post, I had no idea that this functionality exists. I don't know if it's on the codex and I missed it, but I just want to make sure everybody sees it. It's a quick little file. It starts by setting a variable called page now. So in your plugins and your themes, you can always reference what page you are on dynamically. You don't have to know in advance. After that, it does simple browser detection. If you ever, in your theme or plugin, wanted to know if somebody is on Lynx, Gecko, WinIE, MacIE, which doesn't exist anymore, Opera, NS4 is the old way of saying Mozilla, Safari, Chrome, iPhone, they're all set to false. And then there's a bunch of logic that looks at the HTTP user agent and sets these to true if Safari is matched or Gecko or WinIE, MacIE. So you can do things like in your theme, maybe you're building a responsive design, and when somebody comes from an iPhone, you want your normal ads from your big site to be only iPhone ads. You can write the code that checks to see if is iPhone and only return iPhone ads to that business. And if not, then you return all others. That's just one case, but it's really powerful, and it's all for free, coming right here, already defined for you. And it does the same thing for server detection. It checks to see if the server that's running WordPress is Apache, if it's IIS or IIS7. So you can create custom functionality. Maybe you want a widget for when your other admins log in, it shows the status of the IIS server, or shows the current status of the Apache server. These variables defined here in these 97 lines allow you to do that much more easily than you would if it didn't exist. Now we get two pretty important functions. We get our taxonomies and our post types at this point. The taxonomies come from, we saw it was taxonomies.php, which came in section 3 when we loaded most of WordPress. And we can see what's happening here. At this point, this function is being called, so it's running. It's registering category, post tag, nav menu, link category, which is also called your blog role. It is registering post format, and that's it. And we can see here at the end, when taxonomy.php was required in that big long list of 36 files, one of the things that happened when it was required is this add action was run. So not only are we running create initial taxonomies now, that function has also been added to the init function, which we're going to see at the end of this file. This is the stuff that kept me in a loop the whole time that I was trying to figure out how it worked. Basically what happens is they're needed now because the plugins are about to load. And your plugins may need taxonomies and post types to accomplish its job. But there may be other information that your taxonomies need. So they get loaded now so your plugins have them, and then they get run again on the init hook so that they can finish their initialization. It's like leapfrogging around. Initial post types is almost the same thing except it's just for post types. That comes from post.php, and we can see it's registering post, page, attachment, revision, nav menu item, and then it also registers the statuses. This is how you're able to publish, set something for the future, save as draft, set as pending, mark it private, put it in the trash. All that comes from create initial post types, which does the same thing. It's also added to the init hook, and we're going to see that in a few minutes. So now we have taxonomies and post types. Next up, WordPress registers your theme directory by passing in the result of get theme root. It basically says where's the root of the theme, pass that to register, and registers your theme directory. And then here's all our plugins. We're in section 4, and it's just like the way we saw with MU plugins and the network plugins for Multisite. The WP get active and valid plugins returns an array of active and valid plugins, and the for each loop steps over each of them, enabling them. We then get pluggable, which I don't know. I'm not a plugin developer. I'm still a theme developer. The comments say that these functions can be replaced via plugins. So if you look through here and see a function that you would like to overwrite, that's what they're here for. WordPress will enable them if you haven't already overridden them. And then of course it has its own deprecated file as well. Internal encoding is like UTF-8 or UTF-16, it defaults to UTF-8. and we get the finalization, the WP cache post load. So if you are using an advanced caching plugin, this is where it steps in and it will define WP cache post load to finish up whatever it needs to provide proper caching on your site. And then we see another action, which is plugins loaded. If you need to do anything right now, you need to add any functionality or change anything, inject your own code, you can attach it to the plugins loaded do action. Then we get functionality constants, which also comes from default constants.php back in section 1. The functionality constants are your autosave interval, your empty trash days, and your WP post revisions. So let's say, for argument's sake, I don't want to have any post revisions and I want my trash emptied every 5 days. In my WP config file, I can define these constants and they won't be set here to their default values. But you can see you get 60 on autosave, 30 days on emptying trash, and post revisions will be created because that's true. This is where magic quotes gets turned back on. Again, don't know the exact reason why it was turned off, but it turned back on again. Then we get another do action if you need to do anything after your cookies are all set up. Your plugin, maybe you're making a plugin that works with cookies. This is the action where you want to attach your code to be executed, because it will get called at this point. Section 5 is all about classes, the core classes. This is the part that we're really going to glaze over because we could probably do an entire presentation just on these classes alone, maybe even 1 or 2 of them. Basically, what's going to happen here in section 5 is the WP query class is going to be instantiated. The WP rewrite class, which works with permalinks and pretty URLs, that's going to be instantiated. The WP class, which we saw defined in class-WP, it gets instantiated here. That's, in the comments, that's called the global WordPress object. It handles working with the query, working with users. It's like the umbrella class, I guess you could think of it. All the other classes are underneath it. And then WP widget factory, that gets instantiated, and we get a setup theme action hook. We can see that. It looks like not a lot of code. It's really not. But if you understand object-oriented design and working with classes in PHP, you know that each of these lines could be calling thousands of lines of class code to instantiate and work properly. But you can see we get a variable WP query. That is a new WP query object, which is a wrapper around your database that allows you to get posts in and out. Then a convenience variable is set up. That equal ands, that means assign the address of WP the query to WP query. They're basically the same thing. It's like a pointer. WP rewrite, we talked about, is working with permalinks, so you get that variable. This is the WP class from class-WP, that's getting instantiated there. And then the widget factory is getting set up so that at this point, we're about done. We're up to section 6 now, so we're going to be moving into themes in a second. But now at this point, basically all of the functionality of WordPress is in place. There's just going to be tying up, some loose ends in section 6. We get the setup theme. If your plugin or a theme needs to do something, I guess just a plugin because the themes aren't set up yet. So if you have a plugin that needs to do something before the themes begin setting up, that's what this hook is for. Part 6 is the final stretch. We define constants for finding the template and the default theme. We finished the loading of the locale and instantiating the WP locale class. Every time you see locale, think language. That's what the locale stuff is for. It loads the active themes functions.php. Executes the after setup theme. That's what I meant before by if you have a plugin that needs to do something before a theme sets itself up, that's what that previous do action was for. We're going to see the after setup theme defined in there. It also sets up the current user and executes the init and WP loaded action hooks. And we can see that here. We've got some templating constants, which I think most of you will probably recognize. We're in default constants again. We get template path, style sheet path, and WP default theme. Those are pretty familiar to most theme developers. The default text domain is another language and localization related function. The WP, the locale.php is loaded, and then the WP locale is instantiated. So now at this point, anything related to the language that your blog is written in has now been set up. And then if there are any theme developers here who wondered why your parent directory loads everything except for the functions.php first, your child's functions.php comes first, but everything else in the parent is loaded before it. This is the code that's responsible for that. It looks to see if template path is different from style sheet path, and if it is, it requires style sheet path, and if it isn't, and then it does template path, and if it isn't, then it just does template path. So we get our child's functions.php first, and the rest of the parent theme loads, and then your parent theme's functions.php comes after that. That's why that happens. And then you have your after setup theme. If you have a plugin that does anything to themes and you need them to all be loaded, this is the hook that's for you. We get post thumbnail support by passing that into the require if theme supports function. Register shutdown function is a PHP function, not a WordPress function. It will execute any function you pass to it when the script finishes loading, or when you call exit. That also works too. And we see in section 5, we saw the WP variable is an instance of the WP class. Right here, this nifty $WP right arrow init, that is calling the init method inside of the WP object, which is responsible for setting up the user and making sure the global environment is the way that it's supposed to be. Then we get an init action. This is where the custom taxonomies and the custom post types were all added earlier, so they get run again. A whole bunch of other stuff gets added. If you need to do anything when WordPress is done loading, this hook is for you. If you need WordPress to be initialized when you run something. One last check for Multisite, and then a final do action, because the possibility exists that you need to do something to something else that's running on the internet. So you have a WP loaded action in case you need to do something that isn't set up until init is done. And that finishes WP settings. That's the core. That's everything that we expect as a plugin developer, as a theme developer, working with your headers and your footers and your sidebars and your widgets, and everything that you expect when you open up your editor to create a site is now in existence. And I just want to recap, since we took that break. We started at index.php. Index.php required WP blog header after setting WP use themes to true. WP blog header required WP load. WP load required WP config. WP config required WP settings, which we just saw and talked about. And so now we're back in WP blog header again. Yes, there's more. WP load is what led us to where we are. That's why it's already on the slide. So now we get to finish by seeing what the WP function does and what template loader does. And just for the sake of completeness, this is it. This is WP blog header. We loaded WP load, ran through everything that we just talked about, and now we're about to see what the WP function does. Again, I tried as hard as I could, and I could not find this function anywhere. I challenge anyone to bring up your text editor, open the WordPress core, and search for WP. Tell me how long it takes to do next. So I emailed Mark Jakeworth again, and he pointed out that it is somewhere near the middle of functions.php, so we can actually see this is a 4,500 line file, so I made sure to keep note. WP is on 1565. Oh, am I there?
Yeah.
Oh, I probably should have paid attention to what was going on. So the WP function takes an argument with a default value of an empty string. You can see from WP blog header that we are not sending an argument to WP, but it's there. It's nice to know that it's possible. And basically, its only job is to take that same WordPress global class object that we just looked at, where we ran WP init method. It's now going to run the WP main method. And I can show you that method in class-WP. And that is line 497. And we can see, by calling main, this in a PHP class refers to itself. So it calls its own init method, it calls its own parse request method, it calls its own sent headers method, it calls its own query posts, its own handle 404, and its own register globals, and then does its own do action ref array, which I am not familiar with that function. It's part of the plugin API, but I don't know exactly how it works. Basically, what WP does is it sets up the WP class object. So now the entire environment of WordPress is set and ready to go, loaded with any default values that it needs. And in WP plug header, we see that was called there. And now we get our final file, which is template-loader.php. Template loader first runs an action hook, template redirect. So if you have a theme or a plugin that needs to do something before the template is going to be returned to the visitor, that hook is for you. And we can see the checking is WP use themes. Obviously, if we set this to false in WP config, or we created that integrated site where our blog.php file has WP use themes set to false, none of this is going to happen because we're not using a theme. But since we're just talking about plain vanilla WordPress, we're assuming that WP use themes is true. So it does the template redirect, and then it checks for three things. It checks to see if this is a robot crawling for information from a search engine. If it is, it calls the do robots action so that you can attach something to this event, and then it returns. It then checks to see if this is a request for a feed, which calls the do feed action, which is responsible for making sure your RSS and your atom is all served properly. If that's not true, it checks to see if it's trackback. If it is, it loads WP trackback, which is responsible for handling anything related to a trackback. If none of that is true, WP use themes is checked again, and we get this really weird logic that took me forever to figure out. Normally when you see if, else statements, there's associated blocks of code that lead you to find out what it's doing. We got none of that here. And I was working on something completely different in a Rails app when I remembered that the conditional argument in an if and an else if statement, actual execution of code happens in there. Things aren't just being checked. So we'll take the 404 page as an example. If you went to humanshell.net and you typed in /blah, you're going to get an epic 404 fail page on my site. So in that example, this function is 404 would return true. This is a logical AND operator, which means for this if to be true, the return value of is 404 and the result of assigning the return value from get 404 template to the template variable, if that's true. If both of those are true, then we are definitely in a 404 situation. Nothing else gets executed until right here where the template gets loaded. And in PHP, as we've already talked about, as you include and require files, they are parsed and executed right there in line. So your template is loaded at this point. It's parsed, which creates an HTML page. There's absolutely no more execution going on, so that HTML page becomes the body, which goes into the response, which goes to the client's browser. And that's how the whole loading process works. That's the ball of wax. That's everything.
Say that again.
You want me to start back up at 404?
Yeah.
All right, well, first you see the template variable being set to false, just to make sure there's not some random value stuck in there messing up the logic. Every time we get to this point, template is immediately set to false. All of these conditions are checked. The return value of is 404 and the return value of get 404 template. Same thing for the next line, the next line, the next line. As soon as the result of running is front page and the result of assigning the return value from the get front page template to the template variable, as soon as both of those things become true, then it has successfully found your template. And those functions define the logic. Is it an archive? Is it, you know how you can have like poetry-04.php? You can put category IDs into your template files and they will be picked up by WordPress. That's how it does it. It checks for the truthiness of two things. If it's single, and if the return value of get single template is successfully applied to the template variable, then both of those conditions are true, and this is a single page. And that template, which is now stored inside of the template variable, gets included at the bottom, gets parsed by PHP, no more execution going on, so that generated HTML page becomes the body of the response, and your visitor has their page. That's how that works. And after that, I have, actually skipped all of that, my conclusion, which is just, I hope you learned where the config comes from. I hope you learned how the core uses the config to create the proper environment. I hope you learned how you can interact, at what points, when, where, why, and how can you interact with the process. But above all, I hope some of you learned reading source code, while difficult and frustrating, can have tremendous benefits. The codex is great. Individual blog posts about specific topics are awesome. I highly suggest you check out humanshell.net. But reading source code, for a developer to be able to read the comments from another developer, you can sometimes glean a lot more information than the codex documentation that's written for public consumption. Not always, but sometimes. I got some quick thank yous. I want to thank Steve. I want to thank everybody at WPNYC.org and the Meetup group. I want to thank New Work City for giving us the space to do this tonight. My slides were created using a project called CSSS. It's a CSS-based slideshow framework created by Leah Varro. If you want to see how it works, github.com/Leah Varro/CSS. And I believe, for some reason, GitHub has case-sensitive URLs. I could be wrong about that, but just if it doesn't load, try it with the capitalization. If you want to read more about Leah, she's at leah.varro.me. She does some really amazing stuff with CSS3 gradients, stuff that make you say that there's no way that could be a CSS3 gradient. So definitely check her out. I want to thank all of you, the ones who stayed. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Thanks for pretending like I actually made some sense tonight. You can see the actual slides at that URL. You can see the repo where you can find out how I created the slides at that bottom URL. And the next day or two, I'm going to create a presentation post with useful links to things that I talked about and links to the slides and everything else.
And we're going to have the video up on the site?
The video will be up. I'm going to give you that link to the post so we can have it on WPNYC.org. That's it. Any more questions before we wrap up?
One thing I was curious about, obviously the files that you're showing us are like core files, and you don't want to modify those because anytime you update WordPress, anything you do is going to get overwritten. I'm just wondering, just because I do a lot of work with Drupal and with WordPress, I know with Drupal and with Joomla, is they have a separate HTML overrides file. Like, you know, let's say if you wanted to do something in core, you're able to make a duplicate of that file, put it in the HTML overrides file, and that won't get overwritten when you go and update it. I'm just wondering if there's any way, any safe way to alter the core files without, you know, worrying about having them being overwritten when you go to upgrade.
To the best of my knowledge, the only way to successfully edit a core file is if you are the only administrator who is solely responsible for updates. Aside from that, there's no safe way to edit core files. It can be done, you do it anytime you want, but it's not a best practice. It shouldn't be done. You'll lose track of what you edited. You won't be able to find it. The worst is a client site. You do some core customization and then they come in one day and run an update because it says update, so they click on it. And then they call you and say, why'd you break my site? Core should be avoided.
Speaking of comments and core, you mentioned that you added a lot of comments to those files. Are you submitting those as patches?
No, I didn't. What I meant by that was I added those dividers. I just wanted to make sure that nobody opened WP settings and started looking for all those arrows to see what section they're in. Those are for me. All the other comments are from the WordPress developers.
At the end with the template loader PHP, those get page template and all those functions, what are they doing? They're grabbing the file, executing it, and then spitting it out there at the end?
We'll look at is 404 real quick. They're testing for things.
Right, that would just determine the true or false, but about
Right.
the second function of that.
The second function, all right, I'll go ahead and skip that.
Does that say, is there a 404 template?
The second function is actually the one that's going to be determining the name of the template. The first one is a test to see, is this a 404 situation? Is this a single page? The second one comes from theme.php. This is get 404. And see, this is where it gets crazy because now you've got to find get query template and remember that it's passing a 404 argument. So it looks like it uses a regular expression to sanitize the argument that you passed in, make sure there's no weird stuff in it. And then if empty templates is equal to array type.
Just looking for 404.ph.
Exactly, we passed 404, so then 404 goes here into type, and now templates is assigned type.php, which in this case would result in 404.php being the template. And if you look through more of these, you'll see, you'll see where there'll be a bunch of conditional statements where it'll say type.php, type-id number.php, type-archive.php, and that's how you can see how the template hierarchy is implemented. These functions are looking at what page is being requested, and then it's determining the best template to load. So that's where that happens. Silence.
You did a great job explaining it. You really did.
Yeah, it's a lot. It doesn't. It's not one of those things that ends. You know, it keeps going. I'm still learning. Just creating this presentation from the post, I picked up like 100 new things that I didn't realize or see when I wrote the actual system.
Any other questions or? Really, I think you did a great job. That's funny. Awesome. Thank you, Dominic.